Hi, I'm Samuel Bailey, and I'll be talking about the history within the PR of government. So, we're going to start way back in the beginning from Egypt in the 3300 BC era. So, with Egypt, a lot of the priests, the scribes, and even obviously some pharaohs having some of those priests and scribes manuscript things for their publics to understand how their afterlife work. And what's interesting about the Egyptian PR is that the PR was for the gods, not actually for the publics. Now, moving down to Moses in the 1500s through 1800 BC era, this is a prime example of some of the earliest forms of public relations that we have. So, Moses obviously talked to his people and had them convinced, or I guess convinced isn't the right word. Moses had to relay a message from God. So, in a sense, Moses was the perfect public relations advocate for God. And there were even some times where the people stopped believing in God and stopped believing in Moses, and he just had to keep his publics interested and in contact that way. Now, in Greece in 469, we had Aristotle. Aristotle had a really successful time going out in the public and explaining to people how public relations, well, not how public relations, but how philosophy worked. And he was so successful with his public relations that him and his apprentice Aristotle, his apprentice Plato, learned how to create a library and got funding to create a library, which easily influenced all of governmental systems in Greece at that time. Now, moving on from before Christ to after death, St. Paul was a prime example of someone who was a PR representative. What's interesting about St. Paul is the organization he was working for, technically, if you want to put it that way, is the same organization that he was persecuting at one time. He wrote 13 of the 27 books inside of the Bible, and basically his writings influence one of the biggest forms of government we have even still today, and that's the church. So going down to the Gutenberg Bible and the printing in PR, the Gutenberg Bible was a great example of how public relations was able to expand and become what it basically is through its writing. So it allowed for messages to be transferred a lot quicker and for a lot of great public relations stuff. um, Pope Gregory basically was the designer of the public relations that we actually have today within the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church, basically, the way it's designated now at the Vatican, came from Pope Gregory the eighth. Next slide, please. So politics and the PR within it in America. So that actually started in the early 1900s, exactly 1900. So people obviously feared the government at this time because World War I propaganda, as you see, there's a poster right there. That's a prime example of propaganda posters that frightened a lot of individuals within the United States. And that obviously created a lot of distrust from the government because the First World War was a huge disaster. So moving on, the public relations area within the past president of government, they actually refused to use the word public relations with any type of governmental public relations. So they obviously use words like public affairs office, communication specialist, etc. So the old form of public relations within the United States was more of a press agentry, which is obviously a one-way system. And the new version has become a little bit more truthful, but it still falls into that one-way system that we see in the older version of American politics. Next slide, please. So the agency birth in the United States, the first public agency bureaucracy or bureau was the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which ended up monopolizing a lot of companies in 1903. They were business focused, but they formed into that American Telephone Agency and eventually just worked on telecommunications area. Parker and Ivy Lee were the third public bureau and PR agency. And obviously, the PR we understand today comes from Ivy Lee, and his Declaration of Principles and the Right to Know is definitely the system and the model that the government takes today.
So I'm Jack. I'm going to be talking about careers in public relations. So for most people who want to get into public relations, they're going to be starting out in entry-level positions, and the point of this is to have boots on the ground, gauging what public perception is on certain issues. And examples of this are, campaigning door to door, cold calling, attending city meetings, and just, getting a pulse on what their design, location, what their public perception is. So as you work your way up, and this is going to be towards more state politics, city government, stuff like that, jobs are going to open up in higher level positions, and these are going to involve more implementation of policy. So a big tool, especially these days in public relations, is using social media to gauge not only where people stand on certain issues, but also spreading the message of a certain congressman's policy, a bill. And then also another side job that this person might have is tracking media trends and cycles to see where people stand on certain issues. And then the next step on policymaking would be basically answering any questions that the public might have. You're going to be in a higher level position, so your face is going to be out there, and you're going to be in charge of grouping these sorts of questions and then answering them on behalf of a person. Next slide, please. So at the highest level of PR, jobs mainly involve dealing with foreign countries and how the United States is perceived. Especially in today's society, globalization, the entire world is connected, is very important to how our image as a nation is perceived by people in other countries. So your job is going to be, describing certain policies, describing what that administration at the time wants out of that nation, and basically dealing with a much larger group of people. You are no longer just dealing with 30 to 40 people or people within a state. It is now a national and worldwide job. So it's important to point out that careers in public relations are quite difficult to get, because as a person works their way up in the chain of government policy, these jobs are going to become very difficult to get, because the qualifications for having these sorts of jobs becomes very strict, and there's only a couple thousand jobs at the top tier of public relations available. But certainly at the bottom level, the list goes on for the number of positions that are available.
All right. Hello, my name is Zach. I'm going to be talking about the similarities and differences to other PR types. Similarities might be like a target. Say for an advertisement, some companies might create ads to target specific audiences. In political or governmental PR, it basically targets the general public. Next would be goals and objectives. Keep those involved a good and clean reputation. That obviously works for the government side as well as the advertisement side. Try to keep a good, clean conscience for like a company. Next would be control. Both you need to keep up on current events and address it as soon as possible. This, I feel like, goes with advertisements probably the best, because if something happens, you want to get to the solution before it gets out of hand. For government side of that, you want to basically know what you're going to be addressing quick so you can solidify your answer. Next would be strategy. You want to deliver meaningful and relevant information to the public. For that, I feel like the public for everybody would be both government and advertising companies. And last would be credibility. The public will always take what's said to the general public with a grain of salt, no matter who says it, whether that be from an advertising company with like the CEO or whoever, or even through the government, because they're just trying to keep a clean reputation, like I said above. Next. The main differences between PR in government and PR in advertising would be there's two different terms used. There's government relations. This is often used more towards the organization to government type of communication, like regulatory issues, communication to government, representatives, lobbying to try to educate those involved. And then the other form would be public affairs. This is the external side that deals with more broad topics to the public. This is where the real specialists resolve a conflict. This is where they negotiate on the behalf of an organization and create an inclusive solution. And next would be Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm going to be talking about the advantages and disadvantages. So first we have the advantages. The advantages include this field is constantly providing important educational information to the public about informing them what is going on in the world. They also provide information about health and safety, so like anti-smoking or different health campaigns. For example, the picture on the right is from the Real Cost campaign to try and prevent people from smoking to keep them healthy. This quote also kind of explains further about that in such campaigns, saying the California Department of Health Services runs campaigns on a variety of health issues such as childhood immunizations, breast cancer screening, and teen pregnancy prevention. It also builds relationships with government officials and the general public as well. Next slide, please. So then there are also the disadvantages. The first one being it can be a very controversial field and can cause disagreement between the publics just because of differing opinions between different political parties. And practitioners must be super careful on how they deliver information to the public so it's not come across offensively or taken the wrong way, just depending on what they're discussing and talking about. And it can also be very expensive. And this is another quote that I found that kind of goes into that. So it says, California generates about 120 million annually from tobacco taxes, and about 10% of that is devoted to anti-smoking advertising and public relations. In a somewhat ironic twist, however, it is turning out that that as smoking decreases, the amount of taxes collected also decreases, and there is thus less money for such campaigns. So although this money is going into a very beneficial and important campaign, it's still very costly for the government. And then.
All right. I'm the other Hannah, and we're going to talk about special skills and salaries. So some special skills, although there are a lot that go into being a public or PR specialist in general, some special ones that pertain to government PR is verbal and written communication skills, strong research abilities, deep understanding and overall knowledge of an audience. So those two kind of go together because you need to be able to research your audience and know what their needs and what their wants are. And then you must have efficient crisis management and problem-solving skills and well-rounded understanding of social media. So how does the way people interact with social media affect your research abilities and your understanding of an audience? And then if you notice in the top right corner, there's just a little infographic that kind of outlines what crisis management should look like, just some like basic guides to it. So obviously listening to what people are saying and understanding your audience again, and measuring what, when, and how is the issue. So really just analyzing the issue at what it is and just very much taking it to heart. And then talk to people like they are people, so being just very open and honest with them, and then engage with building relationships with them as well. And then salaries. So general PR specialists can earn between $33,690 and $112,310 a year, while a public information officer, which is another word for, or another term for a government PR specialist, they make about $95,980 a year as of 2018. And that comes out to be about $48 an hour for a typical 9-to-5 work week, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It is not uncommon in this industry for you to work overtime or on weekends just because it requires so much attention to detail and just being, you can never be too careful and too over the top with doing your work. So, and then these numbers can also vary depending on location, but they are most often hiring places like California.
Hi, I'm Henry Dooley, and I'm going to be talking about the prospects for the future. So through our research, we found that PR companies around the world agree that innovation in the field will be the cornerstone to their success going forward. Hill Knowlton Strategies, which is one of the biggest and most successful PR companies in the world, notes that every political cycle has a PR novelty, which provides new ways for candidates to interact with the public and get their message across. So this political cycle, podcasts are being used now more than ever. And some examples of that are Bernie Sanders. He was on Joe Rogan's podcast after he announced he was running again. And currently that podcast has 12.5 million views on YouTube alone. I couldn't find the numbers for the Apple podcast downloads and everything else, but that's pretty amazing. And before, when the primaries began, Mayor Pete, he was on 102 podcasts since he announced his campaign. And that was the most appearances by any candidate other than Joe Biden. But Joe Biden started his own podcast, and I believe it's twice a week right now. And so those numbers are a little skewed with who has the most appearances, but Mayor Pete has the most appearances on other podcasts. Democratic presidential candidates appeared on over 680 hours of podcasts during the primaries, which is pretty crazy if you think about that. Next slide, please. So the future of lobbyists. The number of lobbyists that are registered has gone down in recent years due to laws restricting certain practices. And this did have a lot of companies worried, but they're finding different ways to get around that. And that's mostly through technology. So through technology, companies, associations, and interest groups have more tools now more than ever before to impact the decisions of policymakers at every level in politics. Lobbyists can now gather data, stories, videos, and even use Twitter threads that show people's views on certain issues. This also makes it very specific to certain regions, so it's easier for them to target different politicians based on the regions that they want the policies changed in. Government relations companies are now looking for people who are well-versed in communication, social media, web design, and other specialties in technology. Next slide, please. So the future demographics, I couldn't find any actual statistics, but these are all projections. So the field is projected to get more diverse as the skills needed to succeed become more specific. So those skills I mentioned on the last slide, having to do with technology mostly. Diversity in Congress has also led to more diversity in lobbyists as well. So there are more women in Congress than ever, so there are more female lobbyists than ever, and there are more people of color in Congress as well, so more people of color that are lobbyists. So men still outnumber women by a significant margin, but that margin continues to close every year as women begin to open up their own lobbying companies. And the future of demographics of government relations and lobbyists will reflect the demographic changes in political leadership at every level. So we have seen this trend through every level in the government throughout the country, and 2020 should be an interesting year to see how that all progresses.
Hi, my name is Electra, and I'm going to be discussing the case study of Bernie Sanders' political campaign. In current times, we are seeing a very interesting political race going on. With many different candidates and modern technology acting like a roaring beast, the public relations tactics that are being utilized are unlike anything we've seen before. One particular candidate stood out in this race because of his social media presence. And no, it's not Donald Trump. Bernard Sanders, or Bernie, pulled out all the stops to gain the support of not only young people in minority groups, but seemingly troubled and extremely specific publics. Sanders posted every day, stating his support for the LGBTQ community, African American communities, immigrant families, Americans in poverty, etc. Some users of social media reported this online presence as annoying or too much. However, it is worth taking notice that even though they may have found Sanders aggravating, he was the topic of discussion and he was on voters' minds. Sanders' public relations team seems to know how to get people thinking about the future and become excited about his possibility of being the president before he dropped out of the race. His team knew that he typically reaches a younger crowd, so they produced content that is not only released onto social media mediums that are more popular with young people, but in a way that communicated with them through their rhetoric and their terms. This is an interesting and current case study because of how relevant it is to political public relations with their growing world of social media and technology. Sanders' tactics were advantageous and correct because he gained the attention of young voters by becoming someone they can relate to and that they can trust. One example of a strategic move that his PR team made was the hashtag #FeelTheBurn, which was a creative social media tactic used to spread awareness of his campaign back in 2016. It was catchy, easy to say, and it had added comedic effect with using a play on words. Additionally, the hashtag #FeelTheBurn was created by volunteers of the campaign. The volunteers pushed for the campaign managers to use the hashtag, and it turned out to be a great success. This led the social media managers of the campaign to start listening to their followers because they recognized that the fact that their followers may have really good ideas when it comes to trends and ways to give Sanders attention. This hashtag campaign also became something that artists were attracted to. They began making t-shirts, coffee mugs, etc., with artwork that artists from around the country created in support of Sanders' campaign. Bernie's campaign team recognized that in order to catch the eye of younger publics, they needed to entertain them. So they made a campaign that was silly while also holding importance of what Bernie could add to the country if he was in office. Another great example of how Bernie used social media to his advantage was his use of Snapchat filters in voting areas and on big campaign days. The filters created a sense of excitement and sparked thought on voting decisions when voters were heading in to place their ballot. The Bernie Sanders campaign recognized that social media was the fastest way to spread a message, and it would create a powerful connection between the publics that Bernie was targeting and himself. For our discussion questions, we wanted to ask the audience, should Sanders have worked harder to connect with generations that didn't share the social media draw? And how does the social media angle of a political campaign affect generations that aren't involved with media applications?